thank you so much for agreeing to participate in our closing panel for the Sunscreen e-Summit by Michelle Wong and I, a collaborative initiative to democratize information, accurate information for the cosmetics industry. This presentation is going to be on how misinformation in the cosmetic sector is impacting the sunscreen industry. And maybe before we get started, each of you could introduce yourselves. Who are you and what do you do? Myriam, would you like to go first?
I can, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon. At me, it's the evening. So my name is Myriam Sohn. I'm working at the BASF, so since 20 years now, always in the sun care field. I am located in Germany, in the south of Germany, at the Global Technical Center for Sun Care, so where we are doing the development of the UV filters and preparing all the information relating to the filters in our portfolio. So I'm very happy to be here today to speak about this exciting field and hopefully we'll give you some information and, about all these misconceptions.
Next up is Thomas. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Thomas Myers, and I am the General Counsel at the Personal Care Products Council, which is the leading national trade association for the cosmetics industry in the United States. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and I'm very excited to be here today. Happy to talk about whatever you'd like to talk about, but certainly what's happening in the United States. Thank you.
And last but not least, I'm not sure if she needs introductions, but Michelle, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Dr. Michelle Wong. I am a science communicator, cosmetic chemist and chemistry Ph.D. And I make content about the science behind beauty products at Lab Muffin Beauty Science. Plus, I also organize this conference with Jen. Plus, it is 5 a.m., so I highly apologize if I say anything really silly.
Okay, well, I will get right to my first question, which perhaps I'll gear the first one to Myriam, and then the second one on the impacts, I will gear towards Thomas and Michelle. So this question is around, there's a lot of misconceptions around this that are widely published. Are sunscreens really absorbing all the way into the blood and causing toxic effects? That's my question.
Okay, a lot to say. No, maybe just to start to say that all UV filters is the general category of ingredients used in sunscreens because they need approval. Approval that is, it's the same rule, let's say, over the all regions. So they need to be approved to show that they are safe for human. So in Europe is the SCCS committee that evaluate the dossier very carefully to be sure that the molecule is then safe for use. And this test also includes skin penetration tests. And the penetration depends on the molecule, and so mainly on the molecular weight or also lipophilicity or melting point. So the penetration rate differs between the UV filter. So we know that higher the molecular weight and the smaller is the penetration. And so all newer filters that we have in Europe show a penetration rate that is less than 0.1%. But in the FDA, the filters are subjected to the FDA rule because they are not considered as cosmetic, like in Europe, but as drug. So they already go through a tough registration process. And we have seen that with the final tentative monograph from 2019, FDA has categorized the UV filters in different categories. And all the organic or most of the organic UV filters are listed in the category 3. So they require additional data to prove their safety, and starting with a must study, maximum usage trial study. So this is to show that the filter, how the filter penetrates in the plasma. And FDA itself did two of these mass study with a product from the US. And finally, these studies were shown that all filters finally penetrated in the plasma at an amount that is higher of the threshold fixed by the FDA, that is 0.5 nanogram per milliliter. But what FDA clearly states is that the penetration does not mean toxicity. So yes, filters molecule can penetrate, but this does not mean that they have a toxic effect. So this is really two different aspects. And the fact, that the sunscreen are considered as OTC in the US make it more tough, let's say, regarding their testing than in other regions where they are considered like cosmetics. So starting from the fact that they are assumed can be toxic because they are considered like to be a drug.
Okay, so now there's all of these misconceptions in the zeitgeist that sunscreens are killing users. I feel like that would be like the edge of where people are thinking about this. Where do you see these misconceptions stemming from, and how has it impacted the sunscreen sector? And like Myriam, maybe you can also comment on this from the ingredient supply perspective. But first, I will reach to Thomas for this question from the regulatory perspective. How does this kind of misinformation or misconceptions impact regulations?
So that's a great question. And I think you can, certainly kind of building on what Myriam said with regard to the FDA studies, the must studies that they conducted. There was a lot of, I think what happened is it generated a lot of conversation and frankly, consumer confusion around sunscreens and the safety of sunscreens. They conducted these must studies. They found these low concentrations of certain UV filters in the bloodstream, but people immediately equate presence with harm, and that is not accurate. And you have oftentimes people that have knee-jerk reactions to something like this and will simply stop buying those types of sunscreens or the sunscreens that were identified in the study. I think it creates a lot of consumer confusion because they're kind of left trying to figure out the best path forward. And unfortunately, that consumer confusion can turn into increased incidence of skin cancer if people stop using sunscreen products. So that's problematic. But more to your question, which is what is the kind of regulatory impact or policy impact? I like to remind people to kind of keep in mind that these preliminary studies were just that. FDA is seeking additional data on the UV filters, and making policy decisions on incomplete data is just a bad policy all around. So really, we want to try to encourage people, to say, continue to use your sunscreens. FDA itself has repeatedly said, keep using sunscreens as a part of a safe sun regimen. Don't stop using these ingredients and these sunscreens. But that hasn't stopped a lot of noise in the public space about the what I'll say is the issues around the safety of sunscreens.
And Michelle, from your perspective, seeing what's on social media and hearing from the average consumer, what do you think?
Yeah, so I think those FDA studies did cause a lot of fear mongering, especially by like news headlines and people who didn't really read the studies properly, which was a shame because the FDA did put out a press release, which was obviously open access. There was also an open access editorial that accompanied the FDA studies explaining that presence in blood doesn't mean toxicity, as Myriam said. But I think there's just always been these misconceptions about chemical or organic sunscreen filters. And part of it is just simply because their names are quite scary. They're long names, they're complicated chemical names versus the relatively friendly zinc oxide and titanium dioxide, which are a lot easier to spell, a lot less scary sounding. So there was also the 0.5 nanograms per mil, which was the limit for the FDA to assume that nothing was happening. So people kept calling it the safety limit for the FDA, which is not the case. Like the safety limit makes it sound like if you have more than 0.5 nanogram per mil, then you are having toxic effects, which just is not the case. There still hasn't been any long-term harms directly linked. Like there's no one out there who has had, let's say, cancer that was linked to use of sunscreens, or endocrine disruption that was definitively linked to use of sunscreens. In terms of the products that are on the market, a lot of people, because of this sort of fear mongering, and it's happened before the FDA studies as well, they are looking at trying to just use uncoated zinc oxide, which is just not a good idea. So I believe the Crota presentation earlier said, if you have uncoated zinc oxide, like there's a reason for the coatings, like it reduces reactivity, it makes the particles disperse better in the product. It just makes a better product that gives you better protection. If the zinc oxide starts clumping up and aggregating on the skin, then you end up with patches of uncovered skin, which means that the UV can get through. Yeah, so it's changed the demand. Like these sorts of theoretical fears have meant that we end up with, in reality, products that can be proven to be worse. They have much lower SPFs. They aren't as stable. They aren't as waterproof. Like if you go into the water with a poorly formulated zinc product, it will clump up. And then you'll end up with, of course, sunburn and possibly increased skin cancer if you are susceptible to that. Yeah, and I think also Marcel's presentation as well also showed what would happen if we got rid of all the organic sunscreen filters in the US. We would end up with low SPF sunscreens and we wouldn't be able to achieve high UVA protection. So I think, yeah, there's very real harms that can come from misinterpreting information.
And from the ingredient supplier side of things, Myriam?
Yeah, I would say the impact on the sunscreen sector. So when just look at the number of filters that are available in the US and in the other regions. So in the US, there is a smaller number of UV filters that are available, around 20 compared to the Europe, where we have around 30 filters. So, and there is no new registration since decades in the US, and it's a pity because finally it's the consumer who has not access to the new generation of UV filters. So on one side, it's difficult to get high SPF with the filters that are available. Even if now we consider only the category 1, it's very difficult to achieve high SPF. But on the other side, we try to increase the cap of the SPF to 60 plus and maybe even more. So this is already in disagreement between the fact that it's difficult to register new filters, and with these new must studies and the categorization free for the organic filters, it's even more difficult. And how to circumvent this problem, manufacturers start to use so-called booster or illegal filters. So these are molecules that have the same chromophores, so the structure looking like the filters that are registered, but are not listed as a UV filter. So they will bring some UV absorbance, but their toxicity and their safety is not tested. So this is a big problem finally, because we want to have high SPF, we have no filters to achieve them, and then they use other molecules that have the same properties that are not tested at all. And so the risk is a compromise in the photo protection for the consumer, and this is not acceptable.
And now switching over to the environmental impact side of things, there's a lot of ideas out there with respect to how sunscreens are impacting the environment. One quick example based off of Emily Burns's presentation earlier, who most informative presentation ever given on the topic. Seriously, so good. On coral reef impacts from sunscreens, as Reef Safe claims, Is there any truth to some of these misconceptions? And there are so many misconceptions, so you can touch on whichever environmental impact related misconception you want. Any truth to this? And like, there's a lot of black and white statements that choose inorganic or mineral filters instead because they will be environmentally superior. So is there truth? Where's the nuance here? Michelle, maybe would you like to go first on this one because you have written so much on the topic of reef safety, or maybe there's another topic that you'd like to brush on here.
Sure. So reef safe sunscreen is a big thing for consumers. A lot of consumers will be asking questions about whether or not the products they're using is reef safe. So every time I post a sunscreen post, there will almost inevitably be one comment asking, either is the sunscreen reef safe, or there'll be a comment saying, why are you using this sunscreen? You know it kills coral. It's terrible for coral life. You should be switching. And yeah, so that misinformation has spread extremely far. The fact that sunscreens are killing coral reefs, which is just not the case. The things that are in reality killing coral reefs are climate change, climate change, agricultural pollution, and overfishing. Those are the three big ones. And actually, I saw a brand has actually flown their influencers to Fiji. Well, I'll say the brand is BioSuns. They've actually just flown all these influencers to Fiji to promote their coral reef safe product, I believe, or their aquatic safe product, I think. So they've flown all these influencers to Fiji around the world, and they're working on like a coral restoration project there. Coral restoration is just not a very effective way of helping coral reefs. I don't know if you've seen these projects, but basically they're regrowing little corals. The reefs are giant, and these projects are like tiny. They're like 1 square meter versus like thousands of square kilometers. And yeah, so it's just really changing people's priorities for the worst. And I think this is always the problem with misinformation to me. It doesn't give people an accurate idea of what they're doing. So if you want to help the environment, you should probably fly less and not just switch what products you're using. Yeah, I think that's really the biggest issue with that sort of misinformation. Something else that I wanted to touch on was just if you actually look at the BASF's Eco Sun Pass or the DSM version, which I can't remember the name of, if you look at both of them, the worst sunscreen filters for environmentally speaking are octocrylene and zinc oxide. Which is very different from the consumer perception, which is zinc oxide is 100% safe, 100% fantastic for the environment. And yeah, I think, again, like consumers are switching to zinc oxide without considering the fact that zinc oxide is not just pulled out from the ground. It's not just completely inert in the environment. And also it's something that you need to use a much higher percentage of. Plus, if it doesn't work very well, if people are opting for uncoated, then they are increasing their risk of skin cancer. And then you need to think about, well, if you need chemotherapy, then that's going to be a lot worse for the environment than using a slightly different sunscreen.
Myriam, would you like to comment next?
I can just agree with Michelle. Thank you. It's true that the damage on corals lies somewhere else than on the sunscreen. And just coming back to the history, so the whole discussion started, like Emily mentioned earlier in her presentation, about some publications that are quite old, but that started to make a lot of wave in 2015-16. And all these publications are based on different setup, design, and have a lot of gaps in the study design. So there is no comparison possible between the publication, and also the results cannot be taken like it's written black on white. So what we need first is to have a standardized test, to have a harmonized method to really can start to work on these on this studying the impact of the filters on the corals. And at the European level, there is a working group that was founded to develop this standard method. And but this takes time, this takes years, and that's why as a supplier of a UV filter, a main player, we developed indeed a tool to allow our customer to develop more sustainable sunscreens, so to reduce the environmental impact of the filter combination they can choose. And so this is effectively a tool that combines all the environmental data we have for each of the filters that were compiled. And it's not only the water toxicity, but we consider all the environmental compartments. So not to speak a bit broader than just the corals and the reef safe sunscreen. Also consider it's a holistic approach that considers also the terrestrial and the sediment toxicity, and all the data are compiled to come out with a value. It's called EcoSunPass value. And depending on this value, you can make it give you the indication how sustainable or how eco-friendly your sunscreen is. And depending the filter you are using, you can have huge difference about the impact the sunscreen has on the environment. So as a big player in this industry, we really try to provide solution to our customer and to the consumer to be able to choose the best sunscreen in respect of the environment, but without compromise of the health, of course, of the human health of the consumers.
And I'll go over to Thomas next, but also couple in impacts to policy. Our policy guru on the stage.
I don't know if I like that title, but I will say one thing of note, I think, is that, you know, the term reef safe, there's no regulatory definition for what is reef safe. It's really just a marketing term. And I think the general consensus seems to be around the idea that it's mineral sunscreens and not your chemical sunscreens. So that would kind of be the first. What is not accurate, and what Michelle really touched on, is the fact that these sunscreens, these chemical sunscreens, are somehow not safe for the coral reefs. We know that's not true. She pointed out a number of things that I think the general consensus of the scientific community is it's climate change, it's overfishing, it's land-based pollution, it's recreational activities. And you know, the idea that it's somehow attributable to sunscreens. And I know there's been studies in the Great Barrier Reef, for example, where areas where there's widespread coral bleaching, and it's not in areas where there is any tourism or human activity. So we know that that's not always the case. So, and even NOAA itself has on its website has said climate change is the greatest global threat to the coral reefs. So we know that that's really the case, and that the research published to date has yet to establish any real clear link between sunscreen ingredients and coral decline or aquatic toxicity in some form or fashion. So getting to the second part of that is kind of what are the impacts on the sunscreens sector and what has been kind of the policy reaction. Well, we've seen that starting in Hawaii, where we saw legislative bans for certain sunscreen ingredients, particularly oxybenzone and octinoxate. Maui County has tried a couple of times now to really ban all chemical sunscreens. Internationally, we've seen this as well. There's been sunscreen bans in, I think, Aruba and Bonaire and the U.S. Virgin Islands, and even some resorts that are instituting bans in Mexico and in the Caribbean. So this is having some real world effects, despite the fact of what, you know, essentially inconclusive data on this issue. And what Myriam kind of mentioned, this kind of idea of a standard ecotox method is really going to be important. And I know that our team, our scientists, and are working with the University of Maryland and other groups to develop essentially a standardized coral ecotoxicity test. And I think that's going to be really important, especially if we're going to try to push back on some of these regulatory and legislative bans that we're seeing around the world.
Myriam and Michelle, do you have anything to add there before I ask my next question?
Yeah, just maybe to say again that some authorities have taken some premature action, I would say, to ban the filters based on results of studies that were not scientifically designed, let's say, and this is can impact the health of consumer. There are less filters available, and this is a pity. It's a fast action for a big impact regarding the protection.
Yeah, I guess I would just echo that and just remind everyone that politicians aren't scientists. So if something is a law, that doesn't mean that reflects the best science. And also that not all scientists are necessarily dispassionate about the subject. So a lot of the time, small studies will overemphasize their findings. They'll hype up what claims they have because, yeah, that's kind of just what scientific studies do, that to justify what they've done, to try to place it in context. And yeah, it tends to hype up their studies a bit.
Maybe that should be a red flag. If you see somebody doing it, it should be a red flag about their their legitimacy as an expert, or the nuance for the information, the quality of information that they're sharing. Okay, we had some really great questions from the chat, but before we get into those questions, just because there's all of these misconceptions that from both, and we have already touched on this in many ways, but that from like an environmental and health perspective, inorganic or mineral or natural, whatever you're going to call it, zinc oxide, titanium dioxide filters are better than organic filters. Firstly, is this true? But also, how does this impact the industry and the consumer for better or worse? Thomas, would you like to get started on this question?
Sure, happy to. So I think human health-wise, the best product, of course, is the one that consumers are going to use. So whether it's mineral or chemical, I think as long as they're taking steps, that's great. You know, it's really about the need for more approved filters. You know, I was listening to Myriam when she remarked how, you know, Europe has so many more. Yes, they're regulated as cosmetics there, as opposed to drugs. But they have almost twice the number that we do of UV filters, and the ability to innovate, to have many more products on the market. There's a real need to have the FDA to really have a process for approving more UV filters. And they've tried this in the past, you know, going back now a few years, but back at the time of the Sunscreen Innovation Act, really before that even, then back in 2002, where they introduced this time and extent applications, and these, or TEAs, and these are essentially a way to, you know, a mechanism to get additional products and ingredients into the OTC monograph, under which we regulate sunscreens here. And, you know, that process languished, and there were applications that were put in for new filters to be put into the monograph, and it just languished. And FDA took a lot of criticism for that, to the point where, you know, in 2013 or so, you know, there was congressional action that got in, you know, Congress got involved, essentially said, okay, FDA, you need to make a decision. You have 8 applications in, and you need to make a decision here. And they said, okay, and they just denied them all. So they made a decision. It was not the decision we were hoping for. And so you don't really have a process for getting new filters in. Now they introduced a new process, as I think Myriam touched on. There was the 2019 TFM, a proposed order to you know, really reclassify the existing filters. That is not a way to increase the number of filters. In fact, it went from, you know, 16 down to 2 that were considered GRAS or proposed to be GRAS, 2 that would not be, and then 12 more that needed more data. And so again, we're kind of, you know, over the years, it has gone down from 21 to 20 to 19 to 16. We just keep ticking down. The palette of UV filters continues to shrink in the United States, and it's getting more and more difficult. And if we go down even farther, it's going to be extremely difficult to put out products that are essentially healthy, the consumers, to protect consumers from the harmful effects of the sun. Having said that, again, I think that was human health. I think on the environmental side, again, I just kind of go back to the statement about the need for kind of a robust environmental risk assessment or an ecotox study. I think those are going to be really critical. But having the data that's out there now, which there's questions about there's knowledge gaps, we'll say, and data reliability issues, and I think they really need to shore those up and take a look at that. So anyway, I'll stop there. I probably went a little deeper into the rabbit hole than you probably were expecting, but anyway.
Well, I know my audience is looking for this kind of nuanced information. Myriam, would you like to comment next?
So I would just say from the health point of view, as I already mentioned, the filters, inorganics and organics, are tested and were approved. So they are safe for human. And I guess this is not different in the US, clearly. The difference in the US lies in the fact that it's considered as drug, and real drug, let's say, are designed to penetrate. Sunscreen have much higher molecular weight and are not designed to penetrate. So this is absolutely not different than in Europe. From the environmental point of view, I would not classify between organic and inorganic. Of course, it's molecule dependent. So you have some organic that were shown to be chronic aquatoxic, like octocrylene, but zinc oxide as well. And here it's a bit a misleading situation between what happened between the FDA, who put as category 1, so grace, the titanium and the dioxide, and on the other side, Hawaii is for example, is stating this as a safe for the environment, and it's the filter that are then considered as safe for the environment. But on one side, we speak about human safety, and this misleading transfer from one regulation to another aspect on the environment cannot be done like this, because zinc oxide, even from the natural origin, does not mean that a natural ingredient is safe for the environment. And we know that this is the case for the zinc oxide, who also show toxicity, aquatic toxicity, acute and chronic. So it's really case-by-case situation. Each filters for the environment must be evaluated regarding the data available. And here there is no distinction between the organic or the inorganic. You have in each category the filters that can be more damaging for the environment, more or less.
And finally, Michelle, would you like to comment?
Yeah, so the overall consumer perception in the US and in other English-speaking countries is definitely that zinc oxide is safer for the environment and for human health, which, as Thomas and Myriam have very described in great detail, which is just not the case. And I think that leads to a lot of people using sunscreens that aren't the right ones for them. So for example, you have lots of people trying to use zinc oxide sunscreens, even though they have darker skin. And of course, zinc oxide does tend to be quite whitening, especially if the people go an extra step and they go for non-nano zinc oxide, because nanoparticle zinc oxide also, or nanoparticles in general, also have a lot of fear mongering about them, both for human health and for environmental health. So yeah, you have all these consumers trying to use a product that has a lot of white cast, which means that they automatically use less of it. Plus, it also feels quite chalky, especially if they're going for uncoated. So that again makes them use less. And of course, if you use less sunscreen, then it isn't going to provide the labeled SPF. Which again just means that consumers are giving themselves a false sense of security by using less of a product. And it's quite a big pity because all along they could have been using lighter products. If the US had approved more filters, they could have been using much more effective products that were also light, that are also really good for sensitive skin. Yeah, so it is a massive pity that misinformation has led to a limit, like the legal limit on products in the US. But on top of that, just consumers are choosing things that are not in their own self-interest.
So I will loop in my final question with Ancient Fig Tree had a good comment. So her comment was, or their comment, I'm sorry, their comment was, why does it seem like anti-sunscreen voices or the sunscreen conspiracy theorists are louder and more viral than the pro-sunscreen voices? And like, it's really frustrating to me when I see this, like kind of like in industry, when people like this are getting a platform. Yeah, why does misinformation continually get this platform and continually get a larger platform than truth? There's that side. And then to tie it in with my question, which is kind of relevant, is the industry moving forward productively? And if not, do you have any suggestions? Myriam, would you like to start for this one?
I mean, I guess it's frustrating for us as well, but when the information is worrying, maybe it's distributing faster than when the news is good. I don't know. I know PCPC is very active for the US case, so maybe Thomas can comment on this side. So it's not like if the industry is quiet. We try at our level to provide the right information. I mean, at BASF we have open access to a sun care landing page, which is on our website, Care Chemical, who is really designed for every open question related to the sun care. And we try to do education of the final consumer. So as a supplier, we have mainly contact with our customers, so the manufacturer of the product. Of course, we are discussing all these issues and raising concerns. But if the end consumer is looking for, I don't know, a certain marketing claim, the producer will adapt. So at our level, we can only try to convince our customers, so the manufacturer of the finished formulation, but we also try to do education. We try to be present on social media to answer questions from the end consumer. And as mentioned before, I can just invite you to look at our sun care landing page at the BASF website that really treat of all the open topics, issue, try to clarify and to explain what the facts are. I let the word.
Thomas, would you like to go next?
Sure. So I think the reason, to answer the question that came through the chat, I think the reason that the anti-sunscreen voices are louder is, well, I think their message is simpler, honestly. You know, they if it's bad, people are very well aware there is bleaching out there, coral bleaching. So they know, it's the sunscreens. Okay, sunscreens are bad. I'll use these. It's a much simpler message than saying, well, it's not, you know, it may be in the waters, but, you know, just because it's detected in the water doesn't mean that it's harming the coral. And we have these other tests, and, you know, it becomes a battle of the science. And I think they just kind of tune that out. I think it's a simpler message to say, and frankly, they want to do something about it. Oh, if I can somehow help with this, then this is what I'm going to do. It doesn't matter that the science is incomplete or there's data gaps or any of that other, I think it's just a simpler message. And our message tends to have to be more nuanced. And that makes it more difficult, I think. So that I think is the first part. The second, which is industry moving forward productively on this, and what are we doing? I think two things. One is, at least with the proposed order, now the administrative order. So the 2019 proposed order with the reclassification of the filters, which then became the CARES Act, kind of blew all that up, the 2020 CARES Act, which said, oh no, we have an administrative order process now. So then they basically took the 2019 and made it into a proposed order under this. So it's really the same kind of approach. But the idea is, okay, we as an industry came together and PCPC and our sister trade association, CHIPA, the Consumer Healthcare Products Association,